Hello everyone, thanks for stopping by. Today, I wanted to show how I painted this high-grade Nobel Gundam. This one is pretty different for me, as this is my first commission piece, but more importantly, my first clean build. This footage is all time-lapse, so it's not the best video to demonstrate how I painted this kid or how I hand paint in general. Instead, I want to focus more on my thought process behind this build and just share my thoughts on my first clean build. So I'm painting the feet and lower legs first. I use a dark brown for the feet and a dark gray for the lower legs to represent high socks. In the source material, these are black, but instead I'm using this dark gray because it's less harsh and it'll work better with the other colors. I use this same gray for the inner parts of the feet. At first I thought of using a lighter brown, but dark gray and dark brown work really well together. I also think it's a bit more creative than just using a different shade of brown. My client wanted me to paint this Nobel Gundam like an anime character, so we had a set color scheme to go off of. I just had to adapt it to fit the model. Luckily, the Nobel is a popular Gundam with customization, so I could just browse the internet or social media to see how other builders did similar concepts. One of the ideas I took was to keep the knee areas a separate color from the dark gray, in this case, a white. But the white color I use isn't actually white, but a pale gray. I actually never use pure white regardless of the subject. Not only does a pale gray give off the illusion of white at this scale, it's also a lot easier to brush paint. The brush I use is a number 4 round. This is the main brush I use for painting. It's large enough to cover most surfaces, yet the point allows me to be surprisingly precise. While painting these parts, I'm moving my brush much more than usual in an attempt to get rid of as much paint as possible and have a thin layer. And this is where I start to gain an appreciation for clean builds just because of how much work this was. If I was giving this kit the usual approach, I'd have it done in 4 or 5 days depending on how I pace myself. This took a little under 2 weeks. I'm painting the skirt green as per the source material. The green we wanted was a very particular shade and it had to be as perfect as I could get it. There really isn't anything much else I find noteworthy about it. To get this shade, I use 2 different greens, which brings up a point regarding color mixing. When I want to get a lighter or darker shade of a color, I never use white or black, as those tend to take the vibrance out of your paint. I've included the mixing ratio in the on-screen text, but the majority of the mixture is my lighter green, which I've darkened with a small amount of the darker green. I'm actually impressed with how this green turned out, especially for how simple a mixture it actually is. I try to keep all of my mixtures as simple as possible, with ratios that can be scaled up or down relatively easily, and with as few paints as possible. It makes it easy to remember, which is good if you have to paint the same color several times or run out of paint, or if you have to do a lot of touch-ups even though you handle the kit extremely carefully. I wonder how I know this. This is actually why I try not to mix colors if I can afford it. This does mean that I end up buying more paint, oftentimes buying new paints just for a project, like I did for this one, but having color consistency is important, especially on a clean build. I'm painting the torso and arms blue. Although I really like Vallejo paints for hand painting, I seem to always struggle with painting their blues. They just never work out the way I want, at least in their pure forms. I always add gray to my own blue mixtures since it tends to stabilize the mixture, but it also desaturates it. So if I were painting this for myself, I would add gray, but because we had a blue to stick with, I chose not to. This blue was still a little difficult to paint, even harder than the pale gray, which I found surprising since it's usually easier to paint darker colors than lighter ones. I know I could have used rattle cans since they are objectively an easier way to a smooth paint finish, but hand painting gives me more options for color mixing and is a process I actually enjoy, as I do not like rattle cans at all. It is riskier to hand paint, but my spite for rattle cans is stronger than those risks. I chose to use 2 different blues on the model. It just added a bit of variation. The differences between the 2 are pretty minimal, and I think it adds just enough variation without it totally screaming at you. A tip when mixing paint is to always start off with the lightest color first, and then add the darker colors bit by bit, which helps with conservation since you can get a better judge of your paint mixture quicker. This may sound obvious, but I have done the opposite when I first started painting and just wasted so much paint. I'm painting the face. I use a lot of the same colors as those I used on the rest of the model, but I do use fluorescent green for the eyes to make them pop, painted over a silver base. I used to use clear colors over metallics for eyes, where the metallic color would peek through and make it quote-unquote shine, but I found fluorescents do similar things and maintain their glow even after a flat coat. I found Vallejo's fluorescent green to be the best of their fluorescent colors. The other ones dried weird and sticky. Because the eyes are so small, I can coat the entire surface in one pass. This makes sure my layers are super even and I don't get any weird differences in coverage when the paint dries. Now I'm just painting the hair. As usual, there isn't that much to talk about with this color. I just had to match the source material. I'm glad that I didn't have to paint the hair straight yellow, a notoriously difficult color to paint by hand. I thought I did at first, but this tan is just better. It's easier to paint and goes with the colors much more, and it's accurate with the source material. I also use it to paint the V-fin just like on the original Nobel Gundam. We were trying to come up with alternative colors. I think that at one point we were considering a pink, but keeping the color palette simple really worked out. I'm doing some touch-ups, but because I don't want there to be small flecks of slightly different paint colors, I repaint entire portions of the model for the areas I mixed up colors for. On areas like the different shades of gray, I'll just touch up the bits of exposed primer. And what I honestly should have done was clear coat the model piece by piece, which is something I'll have to keep in mind for future projects. But I wanted the model to have a uniform finish when I would show in progress shots to my client, so he would get a better idea of the progress. I also had to strip the paint in certain areas where the paint dried too thick, most notably around the curved surfaces. After painting, I sprayed the model with a coat of clear semi-gloss to prepare for decals. I found that you don't always need a semi-gloss surface for decals. What you really need is a smooth surface to avoid silvering, but a semi-gloss surface helps, and it also protects the paint. I move my decals into place with metal tweezers, and I've also found that the decal setters and softeners can eat away at your paint if you aren't careful. The decals I'm using are a generic set of markings, but instead of white, they're printed in light gray. We didn't want the markings to scream out at you, and the light gray is a perfect color for this. On the white areas, it doesn't show up too much, but on the other colors, it looks really nice. These decals are from Delphi, and I really like what they do for the model. They break up the monotone finish and add a bit of interest, but because I use them sparingly, they don't take away from the paint job. Delphi decals are also super thin, which makes them look painted on after they dry. They don't leave a raised surface like a sticker, and they actually stay in place, something I can't always say is true for Bandai's water slides. Now I'm going ahead and adding a panel line, which really isn't anything too crazy to talk about, so I want to talk about my thoughts on clean builds, now that I've dipped my feet in the figurative water. I still prefer weathering. Not only are my own personal tastes more partial to the weathered look, it's actually less work to do even though there are more steps to weathering. This paint job was so frustrating because with weathering, any mistakes you make can be tied into the weather. I had to do a lot of touch-ups and even repainted entire sections of the model because through handling the model and the model moving in general, some paint was removed, exposing the gray primer. The hair was a pretty big offender. It removed so much paint from the back skirt just by the pieces touching. With a weathered build, I account for things like that and spray some metallic color before I start painting, so when paint does get removed, it's a chipping effect. Of course, this frustration is also due to me trying something new and having a lack of experience, so overall, this was a helpful learning opportunity, but not one I liked that much. I kinda hate to end this video being semi-negative, but that's how I felt. I try to be as honest as possible here. And if the person who commissioned this build is watching, thank you very much for the opportunity. It was just a bit of a slog getting through this. As usual, thank you very much for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next video, whenever that is.